Welcome to Resilient World. I'm your host, Christine Wormuth, Director of the Adrienne Arched Center for Resilience here at the Atlantic Council. Resilience is a big tent idea that can mean different things to different people. We at the Atlantic Council see resilience as a mindset, a way of approaching problems with an eye towards figuring out how to build capacity to bounce back more quickly from the challenges coming at us every day. Whether it's terrorism, natural disasters, global pandemics, cyber attacks, or even disinformation campaigns. Resilient World features conversations with individuals who are thought leaders when it comes to resilience. Thank you for listening. In today's episode of Resilient World, I'm joined by Admiral Allen, who is probably the most single, well-known former Coast Guard officer. Our conversation will cover the government's response to major crises like Hurricane Katrina and the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, as well as how the federal government's role in managing disaster response has changed in the last several years. Admiral Allen's 36-year career in the Coast Guard culminated with his service as its 23rd Commandant. In 2010, President Obama asked Admiral Allen to serve as the National Incident Commander for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And in 2005, Admiral Allen was seen on TV screens around the country as the principal federal official for Hurricane Katrina in 2005. A graduate of the Coast Guard Academy, Thad has more recently been a senior executive vice president at Booz Allen Hamilton and is now a senior executive advisor for BAH. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about your experiences in your career and your life that relate to resilience. So I think it's fair to say most Americans know you from your time leading the response to Hurricane Katrina more than 10 years ago. That disaster and the local, state, federal response to it revealed many problems with our disaster response system, and it led to a host of reforms and changes. What do you think were the most important one or two changes coming out of the post-Katrina experience?
Well, I think the biggest change was focus on a broader framework to integrate federal, state, and local responses, get it there quicker, have an impact sooner, and to put a premium on cooperation between leaders at all levels.
Do you think that those lessons have stuck? Do you think that for the most part those have been absorbed into the system? Or do you think it is heavily dependent on the personalities that are in the jobs at any given time?
The answer really is both. Doctrine and models only take you so far. As I tell everybody, if models were perfect, crime would have stopped when they issued the 10 Commandments. There's always going to be unique circumstances related to the storm itself. We've just experienced 3 hurricanes that are radically different in their destructive force. There are different types of intellectual capital in terms of the people that are dealing with it, the leadership skills and so forth. The real issue is to create unity of effort and make sure that there's a passing off of intention, request for resources, and coordination, so there's no gap for the people that need those resources very, very badly on the ground. And we've gotten better at that, but we need to continue to get better because the risks change, challenges change, and the world's much more complex.
So you just talked about the 3 hurricanes that we've had. Why do you think we were able to respond reasonably effectively to Hurricane Harvey in Texas and Hurricane Irma in Florida, but yet the response to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico seems to have been going much more slowly? What do you think is behind that difference?
Well, it's a combination of factors, and I would caution anybody to point out one specific issue, person, or set of conditions. First of all, we have the tyranny of distance and geography in Hurricane Maria. You have an isolated island. There's only 2 ways on and off, and that's through the air or by sea. Those were both inhibited right away after the storm. Ports had to be reopened safely, and they had to reestablish air traffic control. On the other hand, you need mayors, governors, the federal folks that are in charge to sit down and say, what is it collectively that we want to do, and have a coordinated, what I call a unity of effort, and focus on what it is you need to do. And everything else should be subordinate to that. Political issues, everything should be subordinate to it if you're going to focus on helping those people. Mm-hmm. And I think in Texas and in Florida, they were more practiced at this than they had in Puerto Rico over a number of years. Had very strong leadership by the governor in Florida, personally urging people to evacuate. In Texas, that was a biblical flood. There's some things you can't plan for. The amount of rain was extraordinary, but you have to adapt throughout the responses.
You know, one of the things I've wondered about watching what's happened in Puerto Rico It felt to me that another important difference between the Texas and Florida experiences in Puerto Rico was the fact that in Puerto Rico, it felt more like the territorial government was, almost decapitated between the complete takedown of the communication system because of the challenges you talked about, sort of about the initial level of preparedness that Puerto Rico had. It felt to me like it was a situation where you really needed the federal part of the response, the federal part of the partnership to lean in more aggressively to kind of compensate for the fact that at the local territorial level, you really didn't have capacity to provide basic services. And I wonder whether you think that that was part of it.
I think it is, but let me provide some context without getting into too much of a civics lesson here. Under the 10th Amendment, all powers not granted to the federal government are reserved to the states. One of those is disaster response. And the federal government has no legal authority to preempt a local mayor or a governor. I found this out very, very quickly during the Katrina response. On the other hand, if the local government loses continuity of government, or they lose the means of command and control, and the elements of civil society will allow them to take resources and apply those to any kind of effective ends, then you have a problem. And there has to be two things have to happen there. One, there has to be a recognition that the problem exists. And you have to fix that problem before you can do anything else, because if you can't take the resources, prioritize them and put them where they need to be, you're not going to be effective. In New Orleans, we effectively lost continuity of government. We didn't recognize it for a week. By the time I got down there a week later, there were probably 80,000 people on ground, but they were all virtually self-deployed. They were being integrated and applied to the highest need. So in Puerto Rico, the immediate need was to do that. And these very isolated small towns in Puerto Rico don't have that structure to support that kind of response. And if the mayors and local emergency managers have not done it before, there's going to be a deficit in what they're able to do themselves. Now here comes the tough call. When do you call the federal government? And does the federal government self-deploy without a request? So there's this chemistry going on for the first several days, and no politician ever wants to say that a problem is beyond their control and they can't handle it. But the fact of the matter is, you have to have a frank, unvarnished conversation. It may be politically difficult to empower operational effectiveness. And that dynamic is different in every storm based on the incumbents that are in the local area, the federal players and so forth. Because of that, I think the mediation of all the stakeholders and how they put that all together in Puerto Rico took longer than it should have.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think your point about the fact that really this is baked into our federalist system is something that not a lot of Americans appreciate or remember. I've seen at least a lot of comparisons to, well, why doesn't this look like what we did in the Haiti earthquake in 2010, for example? And I think, people don't realize that the model we use here in the United States is different than the one we use to help foreign countries. And the feds can't just roll in, as you said. Well,
the fact of the matter is, the feds can self-deploy. For instance, in Katrina, the Coast Guard was already there. Nobody had to tell us to start saving lives. But sooner or later, as you move from life-saving to longer responses and recovery, there has to be a way to bring all this stuff together. And you almost have to have an immediate assessment of the integrated framework and how well it's coming together, and you got to fix it right then if you think there's a problem. I've been asked many, many times if I had to do Katrina over again, what would I do? And I tell everybody I'd like to be there on the 29th of August rather than the 5th of September. Because I think we recognized the problem with continuity of government and stepped in and said there needs to be some other way to do this. Maybe we don't have the Superdome in the convention center. Mm-hmm. And I think you're going to see smaller examples of that in Puerto Rico, where they're trying to go through this process of how do we work together, how do we identify needs, and how do we pass that up and have a response. Ideally, you want it to be like a relay race in track, where you hand the baton off. If somebody's late or leaves too early, there's going to be a gap. I think that's what we're seeing.
So speaking of Hurricane Katrina, that must have been an incredibly challenging situation. And as I've seen you reflect on leadership and how you practice it, doing a little bit of research for this session, one thing that struck me was your comment that leaders need to be responsible for their own morale. And you talked about how as a leader, you can't spend time in the emotional basement. You can't go there and you have to lift other people up with you. Looking back on your experience, whether it was with Hurricane Katrina or whether it was during the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, or even going back to your time when you were Atlantic Area Commander on 9/11, has there ever been a time where you felt like you were, looking at the elevator going down to the emotional basement? And if so, what caused that, and what made it possible for you to avoid going down to that sub-basement?
Well, of course, there were many times that happened. The question is, how do you deal with it when it does happen? I've said the two major keys to leadership success and success in these events are lifelong learning and rapid learning when you need to do it, and emotional intelligence. Part of emotional intelligence is getting hold of your own emotions, managing your temper, what makes you happy, glad, or sad, your ability to express empathy and sympathy, and look at the views of other people. If you look at the overall problem you're trying to solve, you look at the stressors that are on yourself, and you need to tell yourself that you're demonstrating through your behavior what your character is like and what you mean to the response from your people. Never did you more when that's happening, even when you're personally at risk. So I almost take that as I turn that around, almost make it an adrenaline rush. Now's my time, rather than I'm at risk. That's a hard thing to flip around depending on what risk you feel you're at. But you need to do it. The greatest example of this, and a negative example, is Tony Hayward, the CEO of BP, when he made a public national statement that he wanted his life back. Now, he wasn't wrong. There were 40,000 people down there, including Thad Allen, who wanted their life back. It wasn't appropriate. You take everybody to an emotional basement.
Yeah. Do you think it's possible to teach someone emotional intelligence or to learn emotional intelligence, or are people sort of born with that EQ? Or not?
That's a great question. On leadership in general, I tend to reject doing concepts of whether leaders are made or born. To steal Warren Bennis's line, everybody can be a better leader. And part of that, in my view, is lifelong learning and emotional intelligence. I didn't get here overnight. I had a really bad temper when I was a junior officer, and I'm lucky I ever made it to flag. I know Stat Reedus wrote Accidental Admiral, but it really should be my book. So over the years, you find out things that don't work. You find out that when you lose your temper, you give control to somebody else. And a couple of my favorite sayings, and I learned these from folks along the line, don't engage in an argument just because one's possible. And probably the best one in the current political environment is don't ever wrestle with a pig.
Right.
You give muddy and the pig likes it.
Yes.
So I've had a couple of situations where I got put under extreme stress, and a couple of these are on live television. And you just got to decide what you're going to do, and you can't do it by losing your temper. I'll give you an example if you want.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I was in a situation room with Wolf Blitzer during the oil spill. Let me start off by saying the oil spill was different than a natural disaster because there was clear federal preemption. The well was outside state waters, and legislation passed after the Exxon Valdez gives the government the authority to come in and do it. I was doing that. The local parish presidents in Louisiana didn't care for the fact that they did not control the resources after an emergency declaration. I was in a situation with Wolf Blitzer live, and he played a clip from the Anderson Cooper show the night before, and the parish president of Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, basically was calling the president an idiot for hiring me, called me an idiot, and basically said I should be fired. And it was all over. Wolf looks at me and he says, Admiral Allen, do you have a comment? Now, there's a lot of ways you can go when that happens, and I took a big deep breath. I didn't jump into it right away, and I said something to the effect. I said, Wolf, I always appreciate feedback on my performance, but I work for the President of the United States. Do you have another question?
Don't wrestle with the pig.
Don't engage in an argument just because one's possible, and frankly, at that point, Wolf didn't have another question, so we went on to something else.
I cannot imagine. I was in the backbench seats in the real Situation Room for a lot of the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, and it was just an incredibly complex situation where, even the technical solutions to the problem were unknown and were being, it was an experiment. I remember sitting there thinking, thank goodness that the Secretary of Energy is a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and you had John Holdren as well, because there was all this incredible scientific, technical stuff that had to be explained, and very few people could explain it, and frankly, it was all being sort of invented as we tried to solve the problem.
Well, one of the issues with the oil spill, and Joel Achenbach of the Washington Post made fun of me my multiple syllabic words. I said the spill was indeterminate in length, unknown in quantity. There was no way to know when we were going to cap the wells, so we had some unknown amount of oil for some known period of time going into the Gulf of Mexico. Other than that, it wasn't complicated. And the other fact was that it was not a monolithic spill. In the Exxon Valdez, you had 11 million gallons of oil came out and they were there, and then it went places, but having oil come to the surface for 85 days under different wind, sea, and tide conditions produced 100,000 patches of oil, and it really complicated the problem. So trying to explain that level of complexity was difficult, and trying to understand the scope was difficult.
Yeah, no, it was unbelievable. I mean, I again, and just as you said, there was the parish structure in Louisiana. You had multiple states involved. You had, NOAA looking at weather patterns. You had entire sort of, the seafood industry was completely thrown for a loop. I mean, it was just an incredibly complicated and incredibly long event. I mean, unlike a hurricane and a hurricane response, which is sort of, over in about a week, this was something that dragged on for the whole summer, as I recall. And
plus 5 Republican governors and midterm elections.
Yeah, just to throw that in for fun.
Politics are difficult as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, going back a little bit to disaster preparedness, another thing I've been struck by is how, even the new FEMA administrator, Brock Long, has said, we need to do more as citizens to be accountable. I know this is something, Craig Fugate was quoted at the beginning of hurricane season saying that preparedness in the United States sucks in traditional Craig Fugate candor. And I'll confess myself, as someone who sort of worked in the Homeland Security field off and on for years, I don't frankly have the kind of go bag in my trunk that I should. I don't have the kind of family rally point emergency plan that I probably should. Why do you think it's so difficult for Americans to embrace preparedness and really take it seriously? Even after 9/11 and after all of the hurricanes we've had and with continuing terrorism, why do you think it's so hard for us to be prepared? And is there something concrete and specific we can try to do to really get Americans to embrace taking those issues seriously?
Well, resiliency has become a really trendy word.
Yes, a buzzword even.
And a very great word for this organization. And great work that you do. I think what we need to do is start honing the meaning of that word, what it means in application. Resilient for what? We need to understand that events don't create preconditions. And to the extent that they're there, they can exacerbate or ameliorate the problem. And we need to know how we can be more thoughtful in advance of events that can make us more resilient. My working definition of resiliency is it's the sociological equivalent of the immune system. Mm-hmm. If you have a strong immune system and you get a virus or something, you get over it quicker. You may not be quite the same afterwards, but you're on with the rest of your life. And in reference to Brock Long and Craig Fugate's comments, I agree with them. Mm-hmm. I think we need to have a discussion about what personal resiliency means. Community and local government resiliency, and then at the national level, because this makes that argument or that discussion easier when something happens about what the respective roles are. So for an individual, unless you're driven out of your house by you don't have a roof or water or something like that, it's not unreasonable to expect that somebody can last 72 hours. I'm picking that arbitrarily. In terms of food, water, medicine, and things like that. Solar powered lights. You can crank up radios and get the weather and things like that. The more resilient you are as an individual or a family, it creates a virtuous cycle. You don't put a demand on emergency services. You're competent to carry out the direction of your leaders, and you can help your neighbor. I think it's easy to see if you have 2 neighbors in a row that can do that, all of a sudden you're creating community resiliency. And then above that, at the city and the state level, we're talking about the decisions on land use and zoning, which are very, very difficult, and every state has different jurisdictional issues. You got parishes in Louisiana, you got strong home rule in New Jersey, and so forth. But I think we need to start talking about how do we create a virtuous cycle at each one of those levels, and then that defines if there's a shortfall, what you have to do, what the next level up should be able to do to help them. But it starts, in my view, with individual resiliency, mm-hmm. family resiliency.
Do you think, I'm struck as I'm listening to you, you hear that sort of saying that some people learn by reading and observing and other people learn by experiencing. And I wonder if it almost feels to me like most Americans, when it comes to preparedness, seem to be unable to learn other than through direct experience. And if they haven't experienced what it's like to be in a disaster yet, then hence they're not taking it seriously. I mean, again, I wonder if there's some way to, I know that we've invested in all sorts of sort of public service campaigns to talk about preparedness. I'm sure the state of Florida, for example, has probably pioneered a lot of this. I'm just, again, grappling with sort of how to get people to take it more seriously. And I'm wondering, are there lessons learned from a country like Israel, or does that model not really apply because Israel has such a difficult security situation all the time, and we're blessed here in the United States to not have that?
I'm not sure we as individuals understand the entire life cycle of what happens to a person or a family in one of these things. I had a long conversation with several reporters in town during Hurricane Irma regarding the lack of fatalities, or appeared to be no loss of life by the storm surge, which the governor was saying was going to be extreme. And so they were saying nothing happened. And the people that stayed can say, I survived. And I said, not true. The people that stayed put an immediate demand on emergency services because they were there. There was an opportunity cost to support them because they failed to evacuate. And it's just a lack of connectedness in how we think about each other in relation to our mutual responsibilities when these things happen is where the conversation, I think, needs to go. Yeah, you made it through the storm. And now you're saying, bring me water. I don't have any electrical power. And all of a sudden you're a burden. And you could have obviated that if you would have evacuated. I think those are kind of the conversations we need to have. And we keep focusing on natural disasters, but I think we would probably need to really be talking about shocks to systems. I mean, we saw this in Las Vegas. There are different types of shocks that require you to understand how resilient you can be. And sometimes it's just attitudinal. Obviously, the really effective emergency medicine that took place in Las Vegas was because they had anticipated something. Wasn't that, but they anticipated something. And anything you could do to create pre-need relationships and practice things before they happen, you're going to be better off even if you don't get it right on the event.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I mean, I heard several first responders and medical personnel in Las Vegas commenting about how, frankly, many of the sort of mass casualty drills that they've been doing in the past 2 years really helped them be prepared to be able to accept, just enormous numbers of wounded.
Yeah, the other best use case on that is the Boston Marathon bombing. The type of exercises were done with the medical facilities up there. There were decisions that were immediately made because of pre-need relationships and exercises that had been run, and rules that were broken because they had to be broken if they were going to save lives. And in reviewing the whole thing, and I talked to some of the physicians that were involved, when they held by the doctrine that they needed to, it worked, and the rules they broke needed to be broken. And there was very excellent decision making going on then, but a lot of that had to do with pre-need relationships.
Mm-hmm. So stepping back a little bit, you obviously had a long career in the Coast Guard, long career of public service, but you've spent certainly several years now as a very senior executive in the business world. And it feels like, we're at a point in time where there's obviously a lot of emphasis in the current administration on business expertise. Do you think that the government sector can learn things from the business community? And if so, what do you think, from your own experience, what are some of the sort of big lessons that you think the business world has to offer the federal government in particular?
Well, given the current threat and complexity environment we're dealing with right now, I'll give you a really stupid metaphor. Government and the private sector are handcuffed together on a desert island. We better get over it. Let me give you a couple of examples. The first is the rapid advance of technology. Technology is evolving and deploying through the private sector faster than the government can ingest it and deploy it to its own means, nor can they regulate it effectively. And I can give you a host of examples. But the real issue is if we're going to have a way to deal with complex situations and apply that technology to its best use, or regulate for the common welfare and the public good as required in the Constitution, it's going to require rethinking about how the government and the private sector works together, because the current structure cannot act fast enough to make these things happen.
My definition of the Federal Acquisition Regulations and the Code of Federal Regulation is the sum of all market failures. And government's always going to be slow in acquiring and deploying that stuff because we're in a fail-safe mode based on what's happened in the past. There are tremendous workarounds. The CIA has come up with InQtel.
Right.
Robert Cardillo at NGA is looking at a similar type structure on how to deal with commercial imagery. But we're going to have to figure out a way where government can protect the citizens and the private sector can come up with a way to help government in absence of regulations, because no rule can be written quick enough now before the technology overtakes it. And I think that's a real quandary that we're in right now. We're going to have to really put some thought into it. We live in a digitally connected world, but we're incompetent digital citizens. Government has and laws haven't changed. And in the meantime, markets without the controls on them are going to make their best guess. Capital is going to flow to where the lowest labor rates are. Good example, if you have an iPhone.
I do.
There's a GPS chip in it. There's also a Russian GLONASS chip in it because it's more accurate at higher latitudes. Now, the FCC is supposed to issue licenses to allow GPS or global navigation satellite systems in the United States to use foreign systems like Galileo in Europe and Beidou in China.
Yeah.
They've been sitting on the Galileo request for a permit, I think, for over a year now. In the meantime, Apple's building phones with a GLONASS chip in them. They're selling them all over the world. If you don't come to some reconciliation of what's going on, governments will become irrelevant. And you're always going to be caught up in the conversation we had after the San Bernardino shootings with the government encryption and Apple.
Yeah. Well, and it also strikes me.
Probably got off track there, but.
No, but well, it strikes me also that example is, one of the things that we're working on at the Adrian Arsh Resilience Center is trying to come up with, what are sort of the core characteristics of resilient organizations or systems. And I think one of the core traits is redundancy. And the whole issue of GPS, whether it's GPS or Galileo or GLONASS or Beidou, I know when I was at DoD, there were a lot of people who thought it was a good thing to be able to use those other systems, because if we lost GPS, we would be able to switch on to the other systems.
And that's true.
Which gives you the redundancy. So, but you're right, we have to find ways to sort of think through all those challenges. What advice?
But here's the issue on that.
Yeah.
We have the International Civil Aviation Organization to deal with global aviation safety issues. We have the International Maritime Organization to deal with global maritime issues.
We don't have anything for cyber.
We don't have whatever it is, for cyber or P&T or things like that. And this is a globally generalized statement that we have locally in the United States in government. That's the inability of governing structures to keep up with the technology. We're very close on the global navigation satellite systems, but we're not quite right there on reliability and standards. So we actually know that if we switch between these systems, we can actually get predictable, sustainable locating information when we need it.
What advice would you give to folks in the government? So in my experience, a lot of the people that you have in government, even at very senior levels, are people who have spent most of their careers in government, or in some cases they come from academia, or they come from sort of the political sphere. They don't often come from the business community. They don't often have what I would call more technical backgrounds. What advice would you give to people who are in the government who want to be more nimble and more agile and want to be more informed and more able to help build that government private sector partnership that you're talking about? How can people do that more effectively?
Well, it really goes back to the things I talked about earlier, which is lifelong learning and emotional intelligence. I was always very concerned, and when I was the Commandant, I actually talked to my flag officers about this, that we were honing our skills and becoming very good at search and rescue and things like that for 25 or 30 years in the Coast Guard. Our peers, and increasingly the peers of the folks behind us, every 3 to 5 years are recompeting for a job. And when they do that, they have to rewrite their resume, they have to burnish up their computer skills, they have to demonstrate intellectual capital that they can bring to a firm. And they basically, it's not reinventing themselves, but they got to constantly be tweaking that. And I had a fear that Systemically, we were being de-skilled against our peer group that was being forced to do that by economic conditions on the outside, and we didn't have any levers to force that on the inside. So when it comes to overseeing, big programs, you have very senior people that often are not involved technically enough to understand what's going on, and that's when you start having problems in acquisitions.
Well, speaking of big departments and sort of the challenges that come with acquisitions and all of that, Department of Homeland Security is about 15 years old now. It's gone through major, phases of growth. What do you think are the most important things that DHS needs to work on? One school of thought that I've watched for a long time was sort of, let's try and make DHS look like DOD. Let's make it more joint. Let's strengthen the headquarters, give the secretary more ability to ride herd over the components, in the case of DHS, Customs and Border Control, ICE, Coast Guard. Do you think that that's the right model? Is there another way to think about it? What advice would you give the new secretary trying to sort of take DHS to the next level?
Yeah, I don't think DOD is the right model. This is not My Fair Lady or Pygmalion. This is government, and we're trying to deal with problems here. If you go back to the creation of the department, the goal was to have legislation passed by the first anniversary of the 9/11 attacks so they could stand the department up in the fall of 2002. That legislation got bogged down, partly in a discussion of work rules and civil service reform led by Joe Lieberman, which were valid questions to ask. When the legislation finally passed, the president pretty much had no recourse but to sign it. It was on the 25th of November 2002, and it mandated that the department come into existence 60 days later, which is the 25th of January. This was right after midterm elections. There was no way for Congress to come back and impanel themselves and confirm a secretary before the department would have to come into existence. So Congress met hastily and confirmed Tom Ridge to be the first secretary, and he walked into a Dilbert cubicle at 18th and G, and he was the department. And then less than 100 days from the enactment of the legislation, all the components had to come over and become part of the department on the 1st of March 2003. That's not light speed in our bureaucracy. That's some kind of warp drive that we don't even understand or know about. Because of that, there was not the normal things would happen in a merger, acquisition, or startup, including baselining with IT systems, financial accounting systems, HR systems, and they're still wrestling with those problems as we go forward. What we're going to have, and I've had this conversation with every secretary, is a secretary that comes in with a mandate to deal with the enterprise itself and the empowering functions and capabilities that actually produce mission results. And the secretary is going to have a commitment to do that and a commitment from the components to do it. And if he doesn't get that commitment, I think he's going to have to look at changes to people out.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that we haven't had, we haven't had necessarily a secretary that's had that mandate or has had the ability for whatever reason to see that change through. I mean, these are inherently kind of non-sexy things that you're talking about, but they're really important. And, we've had several different secretaries. Maybe part of the challenge is, they don't stay long enough, or, but it feels like the dynamics that you're talking about are ones that have been true for some time, and yet we haven't been able to make the changes that you're talking about.
I think every secretary recognizes it, but it's after they're into the job.
You get sucked into the day-to-day and the crisis.
I call it the tyranny of the present.
Yeah.
It's the shoe bomber, it's the laptops, it's the 3-ounce bottles, it's whatever that's going on at the time.
Long lines of TSA.
And all of a sudden, you're 6 or 12 months into, fighting the day-to-day battles, and all of a sudden you're still getting IG reports and GAO reports saying you're still on the high risk list.
Yeah.
That's the reason I believe the only way, there's two ways it's going to change. One, there's going to have to be enough upfront knowledge where the secretary is going to say this has got to be part of my requirement to be an effective secretary. And this is not a value judgment, because all of our secretaries have worked really, really hard.
Of course.
It's trying to understand this up front and kind of put it into the whole process. The way I explain it is probably, I don't know. I explain it in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We talk about food, clothing, and shelter and self-actualization. If you think of self-actualization as excellent mission performance, it doesn't happen without HR, finance, acquisition, and all the stuff at the bottom. I think we need a clearer understanding of those functions as they empower policy and mission execution, which is always talked about during the campaigns. Then all of a sudden, you're talking about building a wall or whatever it is. Well, that requires you to actually Code of Federal Regulations of FAR and everything else. And all of a sudden, there's a lot of frustration. Things are not moving fast because you went in with the end rather than trying to build the functional capability to begin with, be able to effectively do it.
You don't think it's something that could be given to a deputy secretary and said, this is your primary sole job, go forth and execute? Does it inherently require that it be the secretary?
Well, I guess I'll be a little frank here. I actually have made the recommendations on several occasions. They set up a separate program management office with a high-ranking official reporting directly to the secretary that manages that on a day-to-day basis. Not even the deputy should be doing it. She should be somebody off to the side, empowered by both of them to attack these problems daily. So while they're dealing with the laptop computers in Dubai or wherever, somebody every day is looking at, are we getting a clean financial audit and all the things that have to be done?
Yeah.
But to do that, there has to be the commitment up front to get the person in there that's empowered to do it and let them do it. When I became Commandant of the Coast Guard, I did some significant reforms, probably some of the more substantial than anything since World War II. And I took a flag officer and put her in charge of the program executive office. Laid out a work breakdown structure, tracked all the line items pretty much as you would a major program. And had I not done that, I would have been sucked into trying to do that and handle the other things at the same time, which were the Haiti earthquake, the oil spill,
Right.
and the things that you always have to deal with. I think it's absolutely imperative that enterprise agenda be laid out for the entire department and to be given to somebody that's responsible directly to the secretary and the deputy secretary and then held accountable to do it.
How much of an impediment do you think that the tortured congressional oversight for DHS is in that context? Could you still make significant progress even if we couldn't do anything to fix congressional oversight for DHS?
Sure.
Yeah.
Most of the things I'm talking about don't require congressional permission. How you adjust your financial accounts so that everybody looks the same and how they spend money so you have comparability on investment chances, or how you do pay other than estimating the total pay that you need to get from Congress doesn't involve Congress. We succeeded in getting single appropriations committees when the department was formed. That was good. The rest of it is chaos. I sat in on a Annenberg Foundation Aspen Institute study of oversight of congressional oversight of Homeland Security a few years ago with former secretaries and the co-chairs of the 9/11 Commission. And that's one of the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission that's never been carried out, and that's congressional reform. It leads me to sadly say sometime with trying to get a laugh, but it's probably too much of an element of truth in it, that Congress is that body that engages in random acts of aftersight. That's Allen's opinion.
To just close things out, Thad, as you sort of, look back on your travels, on all of your work, is there something that stands out to you as an example of resilience in action? When you think about resilience, is there some person or entity or group that you thought really embodied what it means to be resilient?
Sure. At a community level, I look at the difference between the Louisiana communities that were impacted by Katrina in southeast Louisiana versus the parishes that were impacted by Rita in southwest Louisiana. I don't have to enumerate the issues we had in and around New Orleans. In southwest Louisiana, it was, give me what's due and get out of my way. It's just like, really hard-nosed, hard-scrabble people down there said, listen, I want what I'm due, then I'll take care of this. Just two completely different mindsets in the same state.
Yeah.
It was very, very different. The best example I use on all of this may not be the most elegant, is the superintendent of schools in Joplin, Missouri, during their very, very bad, tornado. His name is C.J. Huff. I've got to know him over the years. If you ever have a chance to go on YouTube and see the speech he gave when they came back to school in the fall, it'll bring tears to your eyes. He came in as superintendent of schools in Joplin with a commitment to increase the graduation rate, lower the dropout rate. He made connections in the city got corporate leaders behind it, and was well on his way to achieving remarkable success in that regard. When the tornado came through in May, they were actually having a graduation over at a university on the other side of town. If the kids had been in that school, there'd have been tremendous loss of life. There is YouTube footage of security cameras inside the high school as the cafeteria and the gym implode.
Wow.
I think it was on a Wednesday. I could be not quite right on it, but that week he made payroll for his teachers. He got his IT stuff up and operating. They started high school on time in the fall in a vacant shopping center that they found in the city, and they put a football team on the field that was highlighted in a special by ESPN. The pre-need relationships that he had in that town created a resiliency in terms of the ability to subscribe to a common set of goals that made something that was going to be very, very hard not as hard. Plus, just an extraordinary leader, a motivator. So when I really want to get people pulling out their handkerchiefs and talk about resiliency, I tell people that Joplin was more successful than they would have been coming back after that tornado because they agreed before the storm that they loved their children.
Something we can all agree on,
Yeah.
I hope. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time. This was incredibly interesting and informative. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Resilient World. If you enjoyed the podcast, please don't forget to rate and subscribe to us in Apple Podcast Store, where you can also find our previous episodes. We'll see you again in 2 weeks.